right, y'all, welcome back to the show. It's Anti-War Radio, Chaos 95.9 in Austin, Texas. We're streaming live worldwide on the internet at chaosradioaustin.org and at antiwar.com/radio. And our next guest today is Anand Gopal. He is a reporter for the Christian Science Monitor and Wall Street Journal, or at least has been. He has a new report that is a project of TomDispatch.com and of the Nation Institute. It's called Obama's Secret Prisons, and you can find it under Tom Englehart's name at antiwar.com. That's original.antiwar.com/Englehart. Welcome to the show, Anand. How are you doing today?
Good, thanks for having me.
Well, thank you very much for joining us on the show. Really a groundbreaking story that you have here, and in a way, that's almost news in itself, that really you're the first person to write a story quite like this, and it's already February 2010, huh?
Well, it says something about how much people have been paying attention to the war in the last 5 to 6 years.
Yeah, well, all right, so Obama's Secret Prisons, basically, if I can try to break this down a little bit, I guess it's really the same story, but you're talking specifically about these night raids, and that's something that we don't hear too much about. So why don't you, I guess, just kind of give us the background, maybe a couple of examples out of the article if you'd like.
Well, certainly, the night raids refer to U.S. military operations that happen at night, often taking place in people's homes. And the point of these operations is to find people who are deemed as threats, ties to the insurgents, bomb makers, that sort of thing. And they usually take people from the homes and take them away to a series of bases across the country. And it's the process of night raid and detentions has done a lot to undermine the support of coalition forces amongst the local population.
Ah, I see. Yeah, and in fact, that's something that you actually spend quite a bit of time on in the article, is quoting people who said, well, we welcome the Americans. After all, it's not like we're the Soviets or anything, and we thought that they would be all right. In fact, you quote one guy saying, I used to go on TV and tell people to support the Karzai government, to support the American occupation for the time being, and now he's decided to change his mind. That's one specific example, but you say that really kind of across the country, people who formerly, at least grudgingly, accepted the American occupation are now starting to turn more and more against it because of this very activity.
Well, that's right. This is particularly true for the rural Pashtun countryside. It's a different story outside of those areas, but in my story, I mostly focus in those parts of the country. The one person that you mentioned who went on TV, who used to go on TV and defend the government, his case is interesting because there was a night raid in his home in which 2 of his cousins were killed in the course of it, and another of his cousins was taken, and his family doesn't know where his cousin is today. The soldiers took him, and presumably he's in some military base, most likely Bagram prison, but his family's had no contact, and they have no way of following up with what's actually happened to him.
Well, now, let me make a crude metaphor or analogy or something, and you kind of set me straight. I sort of kind of picked up a theme in this article. It kind of reminded me about reading about Iraq, even maybe late 2003, early 2004, where we're doing these sweeps. And anyone sitting back here in America can look at it and predict that all you're going to do is create more and more enemies and make things harder and harder for yourselves. Is that basically what we're seeing here? Is those kind of General Casey-style search and destroy missions and rounding people up in sweeps and the very kind of thing that creates the insurgency they claim they're trying to stop?
It's a similar sort of thing. And this is counterterrorism, the term there, where the idea is that you need to either assassinate or remove insurgents and those who associate with them from the scene. And the effect in Iraq was that it alienated the population. The same sort of thing is happening here. Some of the same people who are in charge of counterterrorism operations in Iraq are now doing so in Afghanistan. So they brought this whole strategy over from that theater to this one.
Yeah, I'm always kind of confused about that, whether, they say that the counterinsurgency doctrine, as revised by General Petraeus, etc., is to abandon search and destroy in favor of clear, hold, and build, and that kind of thing. And yet, it sure sounds like search and destroy to me when you're talking about just rounding up fighting-age males in whatever village.
Well, that's right, and there's a tension between counterinsurgency, which is the notion of going and trying to protect the civilian population so you can win their hearts and minds, and counterterrorism. And it seems to me, when talking to military officials, that they haven't adequately resolved that tension, because on the one hand, there is, at least verbally, there's a sense that they need to stop doing these sorts of things. And in fact, General McChrystal, the main commander in Afghanistan, put out a directive in summer saying we need to limit night raids and other sorts of operations that cause offense amongst the population. But at the same time, it still continues, and it really hasn't abated in any way since that directive.
All right, now talk to me about the series of bases, these black jails or black sites across the country. It's Bagram, I guess, has been reported. They've put a bunch of money into modernizing Bagram and turning it into a, wonderful Colorado-style supermax facility. So apparently they're not just beating people to death at Bagram like they did poor Dilawar, the cab driver, back in the day, but they're doing that everywhere else. Is that it?
Well, you're right, Bagram has gotten a lot better. But there are these smaller prisons, there's at least 9 that we know of officially, and then perhaps more that we don't know of, that sit on small U.S. military outposts throughout the country. And of the people I interviewed, I interviewed about a half a dozen, and more than half said that they were abused either at these sites or on the way to these sites.
Well, so can you tell us what you learned about these sites from them?
Well, these are tiny sites that are usually run by U.S. Special Operations Forces. They're typically used for interrogation. So people are brought from the homes to these places, held for 3 or 4 days and interrogated. Especially in the early years, from 2001 to about 2005, there's some pretty gross abuses that are taking place there, including people who are being killed just by being tortured and to the point where they could no longer stay alive. Some of that subsided, but you still have allegations of abuse even today. This runs the gamut from slapping and kicking and punching to sleep deprivation, the use of very loud music throughout the night so that the prisoner cannot fall asleep, to forcing prisoners to assume what's called stress positions. This is where they're made to sit on their knees for extended periods of time. And then after 3 or 4 days of interrogation, the interrogators will deem whether the detainees are a threat or not. And if they're deemed a threat, then they're typically moved from there to Bagram.
Was now all that abuse, is that the bad old days of the David Addington administration, or that's continuing to this day?
I think to an extent it's continuing to this day. The Bush administration curtailed some of this in the last couple of years that it was in power, but there hasn't been a fundamental change since then, since, let's say, 2006, even with the assumption of power of the Obama administration.
Well, and you described some pretty horrific stuff in here. A guy chained to the ceiling, not quite waterboarding, but being forced to drink, basically being waterlogged. That's water torture just the same. In fact, I read a story about a lady who drank water in a radio contest and died of it from too much. So that's the kind of torture that they're continuing to use on these people. Is that right?
Yeah, there's been more than one case, more than one set of allegations. And the case you're referring to is one in which a prisoner was taken and tied down and then forced to drink 12 bottles of water. And then, he went unconscious, and then he was aroused and vomited uncontrollably after that. This particular prisoner, they also hung upside down for extended periods of time. They also made him kneel on a metal rod as it rolled across his shins, and then sent him on to Bagram after about 3 or 4 days of this. He spent 6 months in Bagram and then was released and given a letter by U.S. authorities saying they had wrongfully imprisoned him.
And did he feel better after that? Oh, sorry.
I think it hasn't really made a difference, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, and you also bring up the question of field executions, and I don't think this part is in your part of the article, but in Tom Englehart's introduction, he brings up again the story of these 8 students who supposedly were taken out and executed, some of them as young as 6th grade, supposedly. Were you able to confirm that, or do you know about that story?
I know about the story, and this refers to an incident which was also a night raid that happened in one part of the country where Special Operations Forces came into a village, and the villagers claimed that these children, the students, were taken out of their homes and tied up and shot.